The brunt of European imperialism was reserved for Africa. Since the 15th century, Europeans had traveled down the West African coast, first looking for a sea route around the continent to India. However, as the Americas began to be colonized, Europeans looked to Africa more and more for slaves to work the New World plantations. Millions of Africans were transplanted across the ocean until the slave trade was stopped in 1807. After that, European interest waned in Africa. Up until 1875, there was very little interest in the continent and its peoples. About that time, the Industrial Revolution took off in full force, and European interest again peaked in Africa, as they searched for raw materials to feed their factories and new markets to sell their finished goods. The scramble for Africa, as it is sometimes called, really started at the Berlin Conference in Germany, 1884 to 1885. Here, to avoid war amongst themselves, 14 European countries and the United States carved up the continent of Africa. It is interesting to note that not one single African was present at the conference. The Berlin Conference also devised the ground rules for colonial rule in Africa. According to the rules, any European state could establish African colonies after notifying the others of its intentions and occupying previously unclaimed territory. During the 1890s, European imperialists sent armies to impose colonial rule on the African territories they intended to claim. Although resistance to colonial rule was often fierce, European cannons and machine guns rarely failed to defeat African forces. By the turn of the century, European colonies embraced all of Africa except for Ethiopia, where native forces fought off Italian efforts at colonization in 1896, and Liberia, a small republic in West Africa that was effectively a dependency of the United States. The Europeans ruled their African holdings by one of two ways: indirect or direct rule. Under direct rule, colonies were headed by European personnel who assumed responsibility for tax collection, labor, and military recruitment and law and order. In contrast, indirect rule sought to exercise control over subject populations through already existing indigenous institutions. All over Africa, Europeans made great wealth as they extracted raw materials such as rubber, tin, copper, gold, and precious stones such as diamonds at the expense of Africans. Perhaps the worst case of European greed and imperialism was found in Central Africa in a place known as the Belgian Congo. In the 1870s, King Leopold II of Belgium established a colony with the sole purpose of extracting lucrative rubber, and he used forced labor to do so. Working conditions were brutal. Africans in the Belgian Congo were subjugated to amputation of their hands and feet if they did not meet Leopold's allotted quotas of rubber. Taxes and other abuses were also high, and estimates of the cost of African lives during his rule ranged from 4 to 8 million jed. In 1908, the Belgian government finally wrestled control of the colony out of Leopold's hands after the abuses became public.